The house lights at the Crescendo Club had been dimmed for exactly 47 minutes when Dean Martin did something no performer in that room had ever done before. What no one in that room realized, at least not yet, was that this night had nothing to do with those men at all. He refused to leave the stage, not because the crowd wanted more, not because the music hadn't stopped, but because three men in dark suits had walked in through the service entrance, and Dean Martin, the man who'd spent his entire career avoiding confrontation with a smile and a drink, decided that tonight of all nights, he would not move. What happened in the next 11 minutes would never appear in any newspaper. No photographer captured it, no reporter filed it, but everyone in that room, from the cigarette girl to the bartender polishing glasses in the back, would remember it as the night Dean Martin taught them what dignity looked like when it refused to bend. The microphone was still warm in his hand when he saw them enter. Dean had been 3 verses into Ain't That a Kick in the Head when the service door opened, just a crack at first. Enough for kitchen light to spill across the burgundy carpet, then wider. The bass player, a kid named Tommy Hutchinson, who'd only been with the band for 6 weeks, missed a note. It was the first time anyone on that stage had missed a note in 17 years. The 3 men didn't hurry. They never did. They moved through the room like smoke through still air, past tables of couples who didn't yet understand that something had shifted, past waiters who suddenly found reasons to step back against the walls. Dean's voice never wavered. His hand on the microphone never tightened. But those who knew him, really knew him, saw something in his eyes change. Marie Castellano, the coat check girl who'd worked the Crescendo for 9 years, would later say it was like watching ice form on a lake. Slow, inevitable, dangerous to test. The orchestra behind him continued playing, but softer now, as if the instruments themselves understood that this was no longer about the music. The spotlight, operated by an old veteran named Samuel Briggs, held steady on Dean's face, catching the slight sheen of perspiration that had nothing to do with the heat of the lights. Dean finished the verse. Then, instead of launching into the chorus, he did something that would be discussed in hushed tones for decades. He stopped singing, but he didn't stop standing. The music continued for exactly 4 more bars before the conductor, Vincent Romano, raised his hand and brought it to silence. The sound died like a conversation interrupted by bad news. In the sudden quiet, you could hear ice settling in glasses. You could hear silk dresses shifting against leather seats. You could hear Dean Martin breathing into a microphone that captured every controlled exhale. The tallest of the 3 men, the one whose presence seemed to pull light from the room, raised his hand, just slightly, just enough. It was an invitation to leave, an invitation that in their world was never declined. The glass tumbler sat on the piano's edge, untouched for the last 3 songs. Dean had poured it himself before the set began. 3 fingers of whiskey, no ice, the way he'd been drinking it since night. The amber liquid caught the stage lights, throwing small patterns across the black lacquer. That glass would become important, but not yet. Marcus Antonelli, that wasn't his real name, but it's what the Crescendo staff called him, stood at the room's center now. He was the kind of man whose suit cost more than most people's cars, whose silence was more threatening than other men's shouting. He'd been coming to the club for 3 years. Always the same table, always the same drink, always the same look of a man who owned things without paperwork. Behind him his 2 companions spread out slightly, standard positioning. Dean had seen it 100 times in 100 clubs. The formation that said, this conversation is going to happen, and it's going to happen now. The audience, 167 people that night, according to the reservation book, sat frozen in that particular way crowds do when they sense violence approaching like weather. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, celebrating her 30th wedding anniversary in the front row, gripped her husband's hand hard enough to leave marks. A young couple near the back, on their 3rd date, would never see each other again after this night. Some moments they would separately conclude, revealed too much about the world. Marcus Antonelli smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, the kind that suggested patience was a courtesy, not a requirement. Dean, he said, and his voice carried across the silent room like a stone across still water, we need to talk. Dean Martin had been in show business for 23 years. He'd played mob-run casinos, union halls, and back rooms where the real business happened after the tourists went home. He knew the rules. Everyone knew the rules. When men like Marcus Antonelli said you needed to talk, you talked. When they said leave, you left. When they said jump, you were already in the air. But Dean didn't move. Instead, he adjusted the microphone stand. A small motion, deliberate. The metal scraped against metal, a sound that in the silence felt like a door closing. "I'm in the middle of a set," Dean said. His voice through the speakers was warm, conversational. The same voice that had sold millions of records, that had made women swoon and men want to be his friend. But underneath it, audible only to those who were listening for it, was something else. Something that hadn't been there in the first verse of Ain't That a Kick in the Head. Something that hadn't been there perhaps ever. Marcus Antonelli's smile widened, though his eyes remained cold as January windows. "The set's over," he said. Dean Martin had been afraid exactly 3 times in his life. The first was in 1928, when his father, Gaetano Crocetti, had stood over him with hands that smelled of steel mill smoke and disappointment, asking why his son couldn't be more like the other boys, the ones who didn't dream of something beyond Steubenville, Ohio. The second was in 1943, when his nose, broken and reset by a boxer's hands, bled through the bandages, and he wondered if he'd just paid to destroy the only thing that made him different from every other Italian kid with a voice and a dream. The third was happening now. But fear, Dean had learned, was like whiskey. You could let it control you, or you could control it. You could let it make you stupid, or you could let it make you clear. Standing on that stage, with Marcus Antonelli's presence filling the room like carbon monoxide, odorless, invisible, deadly, Dean felt the fear settle into his bones. And then he felt something else. He thought of his mother, Angela, dead 6 years now, but still visiting him in dreams, where she spoke in the Abruzzese dialect of his childhood, where she called him Dino, and asked if he was eating enough, if he was happy, if he was being a good man. "Un uomo vero non si piega," she'd told him once. A real man doesn't bend. She'd been talking about his father's drinking, but the words had lodged in Dean's memory like shrapnel, surfacing at unexpected moments. The microphone in his hand felt heavier now, or maybe his hand was just tired. 56 years old, and his hands were tired. His voice was tired. His soul was tired of smiling when he didn't mean it, of laughing at jokes that weren't funny, of pretending that the deals made in back rooms didn't follow him onto stages like this one. Vincent Romano, the conductor, caught Dean's eye, a question in his gaze. The orchestra sat with instruments half raised, waiting. They would follow Dean's lead. They always had. But this was different. This was the kind of moment that ended careers. Ended more than careers. Dean could leave. He could set down the microphone, walk off the stage, have the conversation Marcus Antonelli wanted to have. It would be about territories, probably, or percentages, or someone's nephew who needed a favor. It was always about something that seemed important, until you realized it was just another way of saying you belong to us. He'd done it before. They all had. Every performer who'd ever stood on a stage owned by other men's money had done it. You smiled, you nodded, you agreed to terms you didn't understand, or didn't want to understand. You told yourself it was the price of doing business. You told yourself it didn't matter. But standing there, with the weight of 167 pairs of eyes on him, Dean Martin realized something that would change the trajectory of not just this night, but every night that followed. He was tired of pretending it didn't matter. The glass on the piano hadn't moved, but somehow it seemed fuller now. A trick of the light, perhaps. Or maybe Dean was just noticing it differently. That glass had been poured by his own hand at 8:47 p.m. He'd used the bottle he kept in his dressing room, not the prop bottles filled with apple juice that he sometimes used on television, but real whiskey, Kentucky bourbon, 86 proof, the color of autumn leaves in Ohio. Dean turned slightly, just enough to see it, without taking his eyes off Marcus Antonelli. The movement was small, but in the hyper-vigilant atmosphere of the room, it might as well have been a shout. "You know," Dean said into the microphone, his voice carrying that easy warmth that had made him millions. "I've been singing for people since I was 15 years old." Marcus Antonelli's expression didn't change. But one of his companions, the shorter one with hands that had seen work darker than performance, shifted his weight. A tell. Dean had played enough poker to recognize it. 41 years, Dean continued. 41 years of making people forget their troubles for a few hours, making them laugh, making them feel like maybe the world isn't such a bad place after all. He reached for the glass. The movement was slow, deliberate. Every eye in the room followed his hand as it crossed the space between microphone and piano. His fingers wrapped around the glass, and for a moment, just a moment, the amber liquid caught the spotlight in a way that made it look like captured fire. In all that time, Dean said, lifting the glass but not drinking, I've learned something about performance. The glass hovered at chest height, close enough to drink, far enough to gesture with, a prop and a weapon and a symbol all at once. The show, Dean said, and now his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before, doesn't end when someone in the audience decides it ends. He took a sip, small, controlled. The whiskey traced a line of heat down his throat. It ends when the performer decides it ends. Marcus Antonelli's smile finally disappeared. In its place was something Dean recognized from 100 negotiations in 100 backrooms. Calculation. The mental math of violence versus value, of principle versus profit. Dean, Marcus said, and now his voice had lost its false warmth. You're making a mistake. Dean set the glass back on the piano. The sound it made, crystal against lacquer, rang out like a bell. Maybe, Dean said, but it's my mistake to make. The cigarette girl, Marie Castellano, would remember what happened next in perfect detail for the rest of her life. She would tell the story only 3 times. Once to her husband, on their wedding night, once to her daughter when she turned 21, and once to a reporter who tracked her down 40 years later, though that interview would never be published. Dean Martin turned his back on Marcus Antonelli. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden. He simply turned, facing his orchestra, as if the 3 men who controlled half of Los Angeles's nightclub circuit were no more important than empty chairs. Gentlemen, Dean said to his musicians, his voice steady, almost conversational, I believe we were in the middle of something. Vincent Romano, the conductor, had been leading orchestras for 30 years. He'd played for presidents and criminals, for wedding parties and wakes, but his hand shook as he raised his baton. From the top, he asked. No, Dean said. From where we stopped. Never go backwards. The baton rose, hesitated, fell. The music began again. Tentative at first, like a conversation resumed after an argument. The drums found their rhythm first. Ted Summer had been Dean's drummer for 7 years and would follow him into hell if asked. Then the bass, young Tommy Hutchinson, playing with more confidence than his 6 weeks warranted. The horns came in like sunrise, gradual then all at once. Dean sang. But this wasn't the Dean Martin who'd crooned his way through 1,000 nightclub sets. This wasn't the relaxed, half-drunk persona that had made him famous. This was something else, something raw, something that made the audience lean forward in their seats despite the danger still standing in the center of their sanctuary. He sang, Ain't That a Kick in the Head, like it was a hymn, like it was a confession, like it was the last song he'd ever sing. Marcus Antonelli stood perfectly still. His companions looked to him for guidance, for the signal that would turn this moment into something that would require cleaning crews and silence agreements. But Marcus just stood there, watching Dean's back, measuring something invisible. The song continued. Dean's voice filled the room, pushed against the walls, seemed to make the air itself dense with meaning. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, still gripping her husband's hand in the front row, began to cry. She wouldn't be able to explain why. Not then, not ever. Sometimes, she would say years later, you just recognize when you're seeing something that matters. The applause started in the back. A single person clapping, slow, deliberate. Not the enthusiastic applause of entertainment, but something else, something that sounded like recognition. It was Samuel Briggs, the spotlight operator. 63 years old, veteran of Normandy, 2 Purple Hearts and a lifetime of watching performers from his perch above the crowd. He stood at his station, clapping with the measured rhythm of a man who'd seen enough of life to know courage when it presented itself. The sound carried across the silent room like a challenge. Then Tommy Hutchinson, the young bass player, set down his instrument and joined in. Then Ted Summer at the drums. One by one, the orchestra stopped playing and started clapping. The music dissolved into applause, but Dean kept singing, a cappella now, his voice carrying the melody alone. Someone in the audience stood, a man in his 70s, wearing a suit that had been fashionable 20 years ago. He didn't clap, he just stood, like you'd stand for a flag or a funeral procession. Then his wife stood beside him, then the couple at the next table. Within 30 seconds, everyone in the Crescendo Club was on their feet. Everyone except Marcus Antonelli and his two companions. They stood in an ocean of standing bodies, islands of threat, in a sea of something that looked dangerously like solidarity. The mathematics had changed. The invisible calculus that governed rooms like this, who had power, who had permission, who had the right to speak or silence, had shifted in ways that couldn't be undone. Dean finished the song. The last note hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. He stood with his back still to Marcus, the microphone loose in his hand, sweat now visible on his neck above the perfect collar of his perfect shirt. The applause continued, not raucous, not celebratory. It was the kind of applause you might hear at the end of a very long war, when the outcome isn't victory or defeat, but simply survival. Marcus Antonelli looked around the room, at the standing crowd, at the orchestra, at the bartender, who'd stopped polishing glasses to watch, at the cigarette girl, who stood near the coat check with tears on her face. She didn't bother to hide. Then he looked at Dean Martin's back. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice no longer filled the room. It was just a voice, just words from a man who'd discovered that power was only powerful when people agreed it was. He turned and walked toward the exit, his companions following. Their footsteps were loud in the strange silence between applause. They pushed through the service door, letting in a brief slash of kitchen light and the smell of industrial dishwasher steam. The door closed. Dean Martin finally turned around. His face was pale beneath the stage lights, and those who were close enough could see his hands shaking. But he smiled, not the performative smile of Dean Martin the entertainer, but something smaller, more private, more real. "Well," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying that familiar warmth again, though now it seemed to contain multitudes. "How about we try something with a little less kick?" The laughter that followed was the kind that comes after held breath, after narrowly avoided catastrophe, after witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible but somehow was. The dressing room was smaller than people imagined, 8 by 10 feet, with a mirror surrounded by bulbs that gave off too much heat, and a velvet couch that had seen better decades. Dean sat in front of the mirror, but he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking at his hands. They'd stopped shaking, mostly, but he could still feel the tremor beneath the skin, like an echo of fear that hadn't quite faded. Vincent Romano knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. They'd known each other too long for formality. He closed the door and leaned against it, as if his weight could keep out what had just happened. "That was stupid," Vincent said. "Yes," Dean agreed. "They'll be back, probably. It won't be just 3 next time." "I know." Vincent moved to the small bar in the corner. Every decent dressing room had a bar, and poured 2 drinks. Real drinks, not the apple juice Dean sometimes substituted. He handed one to Dean, and kept one for himself. "Why?" Vincent asked. Dean finally looked at his reflection. 56 years old, the face that had launched 1,000 swoons was showing its age. Lines around the eyes, a softness to the jaw, the accumulated evidence of late nights and hard living and compromise after compromise after compromise. "My mother," Dean said, "used to make this sauce, Sunday sauce she called it, though she'd make it any day she could afford the meat. The whole house would smell like tomatoes and basil and garlic, like home, you know?" Vincent nodded, though he didn't understand yet. "One Sunday, I must have been 12, 13, she's making the sauce and this neighbor comes over, Mrs. Benedetti, bitter woman, lost her husband young, never remarried, made everyone else pay for her unhappiness. She tells my mother the sauce smells wrong, says she's not making it right, says her mother back in Italy would be ashamed." Dean took a sip of his drink. "My mother, she just kept stirring the sauce, didn't say a word. Mrs. Benedetti keeps going, getting meaner, getting louder, and my mother just keeps stirring. Finally, Mrs. Benedetti leaves, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, and Vincent prompted. And my mother looks at me and says, "Dino, you see what I did?" I said yes. You ignored her. And she said no. I kept stirring my sauce. Because when someone tries to ruin what you're making, the only answer is to keep making it. Dean stood, straightening his tie in the mirror. "Tonight," he said, "I kept stirring my sauce." Vincent finished his drink in one swallow. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," he said. "She was," Dean agreed. "She also died broke and forgotten in a house that smelled like other people's disappointment." He turned from the mirror. "But her sauce," he said, "her sauce was perfect." 3 days later, Dean Martin would perform at the Crescendo Club again. The room would be packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding the bar. Marcus Antonelli would not return. Not that night. Not ever. 6 months later, the Crescendo would close. The official reason was a kitchen fire, but everyone knew the truth. Some stands you take change you. Some victories cost more than defeat. The building would become a pharmacy, then a cell phone store, then nothing at all. But that night, that particular night when Dean Martin refused to leave the stage, lived on in the memory of everyone who witnessed it, not as a story they told at parties, but as something more private, a reference point, a reminder that dignity wasn't about never being afraid. It was about choosing what mattered more than fear. Marie Castellano, the cigarette girl, would keep a photograph of the Crescendo's stage in her wallet for the rest of her life. Not a photograph from that night. No one had thought to document what seemed like the beginning of something terrible. Just a regular photograph from a regular night. But when she looked at it, she saw Dean Martin standing with his back to power, singing to an empty melody while everyone rose to their feet. Samuel Briggs, the spotlight operator, would die 15 years later in a Veterans Administration hospital in Long Beach. In his final days, when medication and memory blurred together, he would tell the nurses about being at Normandy, about the landing craft and the sound of metal on sand, and then in the same breath, he would tell them about the night Dean Martin taught him that some beaches were worth taking twice. Tommy Hutchinson, the young bass player who'd only been with the band 6 weeks, would go on to play with Sinatra, with Tony Bennett, with every major name of his generation. But in interviews decades later, when asked about the highlight of his career, he would pause, look somewhere past the interviewer, and say, "I once played a gig where the music stopped but the song continued. I've been trying to find that note again ever since." The glass, that tumbler of whiskey that Dean had set on the piano, sat there until closing time. No one moved it. When the staff cleaned up that night, the bartender, a man named Joseph who'd seen everything there was to see in 20 years of late-night service, poured its contents back into the bottle, not because he was frugal, but because some things deserved to be preserved. Years later, when people who'd been there tried to explain what they'd witnessed, they would struggle with the words. It wasn't about bravery exactly. It wasn't about defiance. It was about something quieter and more essential. It was about the moment when a man famous for his ease, his charm, his ability to make everything look effortless, decided that some efforts were worth making visible. Dean Martin would live another 21 years after that night. He would make more movies, record more songs, tell more jokes. But those who knew him best, the musicians, the stagehands, the people who saw him when the spotlight went dark, would say he was different after that night at the Crescendo. Not harder, not bitter, just more present. As if he'd finally stopped performing and started being. The last time anyone asked him about that night, near the end of his life, when the past seemed more real than the present, Dean had smiled that small private smile that never quite reached his eyes anymore. "You want to know what happened?" he said. "Nothing happened. I sang a song. People stood up. That's what they're supposed to do when the music moves them." Then he'd poured himself a drink, whiskey, no ice, the way he'd been drinking it since 1947, and raised it in a toast to no one in particular. "Here's to the songs that don't end when someone tells them to," he'd said. He drank it in one swallow, set down the glass, and never spoke of that night again. But somewhere, in a safety deposit box in Los Angeles, there is a napkin from the Crescendo Club. On it, in Dean Martin's handwriting, are 5 words: "I kept stirring my sauce." Below that, a date. Below that, nothing. Nothing but the kind of silence that says everything.